good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to this month's Professional Services and Human Capital Categories Office Hours. Today's topic is Source Selection and Evaluation Factors with Becky Bites. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Please note that today's meeting is being recorded and you may opt out at any time. Today's presentation has already been emailed out to everyone on today's call, and it will also be made available in the chat box at the bottom. Though only folks that are using the Zoom app will be able to download it. If you're using your web browser and you haven't received the deck via email, please go ahead and email us at pshcevents@gsa.gov. And I'll put that email address in the chat as well. Your mics are muted and the chat has been disabled and will remain that way during the entirety of today's presentation. But if you have any questions regarding today's topic, please drop that in the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have a portion of today's meeting towards the end where we'll address any questions you may have. We are capturing attendance on our end through the Zoom system, and there's nothing that you need to do on your end. So CLPs will be automatically sent out to everyone on today's call. If you don't receive a certificate within 2 to 4 weeks, please email us at pshcevents@gsa.gov. Finally, a post-event survey will be sent out to everyone following today's webinar, and we kindly ask that you take a few minutes to complete that. It would really help us improve your office hours experience in the future. Finally, today's speaker is Becky Bites. Becky is a procurement analyst for GSA's Professional Services Human Capital Program Operations, which assists with customers and program manager support for topics including protest, regulation, and policy. Becky has 12 years private industry, over 10 years of federal experience. With 2 international deployments focused in aerospace and procurement roles. She has a level 3 FACC in contracting and has a bachelor's degree in project management, acquisition, and a master's degree in acquisition and contract administration. With that, it is a pleasure to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Tim, for also helping get the presentation set up with me this morning. And I'm just going to do a quick mic check to make sure that we have a good, you guys can hear me okay. Carla, can you hear me okay? Am I coming through?
Done.
Okay,
You sound great. Thank you.
I just wanted to make sure before we jump forward and I just started talking. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to go over the topic of source selection and evaluation criteria. Shown on this slide is our overarching agenda. We will be discussing an overview of source selection and evaluation factors, an overview of evaluation criteria, best practices, and resources. And some of what Carla has already mentioned, we will have someone monitoring questions for technical issues, but content-related questions may not be addressed until the end of the presentation. You are welcome to send questions related to the training to pshcevents@gsa.gov. And this email will be shown again at the end of the presentation. Also, this training will become available in about a week or 2 after our session ends, as in posting online. And we'll post to the PSHC Office Hours webinar playlist, which the link will also be provided on the resources page later in this presentation. And last, there is no way to cover everything source selection and evaluation criteria in the hour time limit. So please excuse that we might go down a rabbit hole or 2 in some areas, just with respect to the time limits that we have. So what is source selection? DAU defines source selection as the process where the requirements, recommendations, and government policy relevant to an award decision in a competitive procurement of a project are examined, and the award decision is made. In addition to this DAU definition for source selection, the term is frequently used for referring to acquisitions awarded using the Federal Acquisition Regulations, Parts 13 for simplified acquisition, 14 for sealed bidding, 15 for contract by negotiation. However, it is most commonly used and referred to for FAR Part 15 acquisitions. So that's just some of the common terms that you might hear thrown around. The second link is actually a resource from our GSA Civilian Services Acquisition Workshop, or CSAW team. And the topic was source selection, innovations, and evaluation, and covers evaluating proposals. This session actually explores source selection innovations and how the acquisition team can easily use them to identify best possible proposals for an award. So it was a great link. I ended up watching it a couple times, even just in preparation for this presentation, and highly recommend it. It was even very engaging, even just being recorded. So before we dig into evaluation factors, I do want to share some source selection innovations that were discussed from the seesaw. The first two innovations are on-the-spot consensus and oral presentations / technical demos. So an on-the-spot consensus can streamline an evaluation process by having the evaluation team read the proposals or even attend the oral presentation, and then as a group, evaluate the proposal and immediately document the evaluation decision in real time before starting an evaluation on another proposal. And so one of the benefits of this method is that you might have a time savings in that everybody isn't going through and writing individual consensus reports, and that you can do it all collaboratively together. And you do it on the spot, which is kind of why they cleverly named it. And then the next innovation method is an oral presentation or technical demo, which can streamline the evaluation process to bring the actual technical staff to see and hear proposed solutions. So some considerations with this method are that there's no guarantee to who wrote the content of the proposal, but you can specify key personnel or company executives to present an oral presentation. This method can give evaluators a greater confidence in that the company knows the technical requirement. And although there is no requirement that the sessions be recorded, FAR 15-102 as an echo lists several possibilities for how you can actually document for record to include videotaping. And then to continue some of the source selection innovations, another option is a comparative evaluation, which may streamline the evaluation process because no ratings are assigned. The evaluators compare one offer to another, factor by factor, and then overall at the end. It's ideal for task or delivery orders under FAR Subpart 8.4, FAR 16505, and FAR Part 13. However, this method is not recommended for use under FAR Part 15. The benefit with this method is that there's generally no hang-up on assigning and defending the adjectival ratings. And then moving down to confidence ratings. A confidence rating method may streamline the evaluation process by being simply easier, faster, and a smarter way of evaluation. There is typically no value matrix associated with the evaluation, and this method only requires a few bullets to support the rating, not long drawn-out paragraphs. This is another form of adjectival ratings that allow an evaluator to assign ratings more holistically. The most recent evaluation team that I was actually a part of just this year, we received feedback to consider confidence ratings in the future just because the amount of documentation that we had to produce to support the adjectival ratings that we chose to use, which were like excellent, good, and very typical of what you see on the matrix presented on the screen. And so we definitely had a lengthy report at the end. Even individually, we had very lengthy reports to support the ratings that we used. And so understanding that the requirement we had was not as complex, and our evaluation, we kind of made it more difficult than it had to be. And so I definitely acknowledge that by using confidence ratings in the future, we probably could have had a shorter paragraph for supporting details instead of, I think we ended up probably 15 plus pages of just documentation that we had to do overall, but it definitely could have summarized what we did and made it an easier defense for, jumping between the actual ratings that we used. So I definitely would recommend going like with the high confidence, some confidence, and low confidence if that's something that can work for your evaluation. Going on to why evaluation criteria is important. It's important because it's the factors that are used to determine if a proposal or quote would meet the agency needs. The FAR 15.304 B as in Bravo pretty much succinctly answers this question in that evaluation factors and subfactors are important because they must represent the key areas of importance and emphasis to be considered in the source selection decision and support meaningful comparison and discrimination between and amongst competing proposals. And just as a special plug, just because it's very important on the subject of source selection and source selection information, but we want to make sure source selection information is appropriately marked and controlled. Source selection information, meaning any information that is prepared for use by the agency for the purpose of evaluating bids and proposals to enter into an agency procurement contract. If the information has not been previously made available to the public or disclosed publicly, you can also see FAR 2.101 for the full definition and some of the examples of what might meet source selection sensitive information. And also you can go to FAR 3.104 regarding procurement integrity. And so continuing on to evaluation factors, most of us know about the overarching evaluation factors being price and non-price. A price factor being the total cost and price of a requirement in response to a solicitation, while non-price factors are that criteria minus that of any cost price related criteria in response to the solicitation. So a couple examples of non-price factors could be key personnel or corporate experience. And evaluation methods that may be leveraged are lowest price technically acceptable, or even use of trade-offs depending on the complexity of the requirement. So looking at our best value continuum graphic here, specific to the price factor being most important, the use of lowest price technically acceptable method for evaluation could be appropriate. LPTA can be used when the expected outcome or result of the source selection is a technically acceptable proposal at the lowest evaluated price. So with LPTA, you will typically see a well-defined or less complex requirement. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if price and non-price factors are important, either equal or unequal, then use of trade-offs could be appropriate because this method can be used when it's in the best interest of the government to consider award to an other than lowest price offer or to other than highest technically rated offer. So I will share that if the decision is to use LPTA, best value, or other evaluation method, then we only want to evaluate how and what we stated that we would evaluate. So I know in my past, we likely have all had the pleasure of reviewing contract files. That was kind of one of our initial tasks whenever we got someone new in the office. And so I did that quite frequently for my first couple years. And so we also did contract file audits to some extent. And one that I actually got to review, I always remember because I was very early in my 1102 career coming into federal government. I received the task to perform a peer review on one of the acquisition files. And for basically anything that might require a memo to file, correction, just to kind of beef up our acquisition files. It was just a housekeeping kind of thing. And I came across a decision document and a technical evaluation report. And there was an evaluation that was LPTA. And when I was reading through the write-up, the LPTA evaluation started shifting away from that technical acceptable rating that they had kind of established. And you started reading in the technical piece where it started saying good, very good, and kind of so on, instead of sticking with the technically acceptable. It was technically unacceptable, technically acceptable were their two options. And so it's just something to be careful about and always kind of revert back to the evaluation criteria, evaluation methodology, section L, section M, source selection plan, anything that's being used, and stay within the parameters that were set up for that evaluation. And that's actually kind of a best tip that I do as a takeaway. Even on the most recent evaluations I did, I always try to have a dual monitor set up so I can have the RFP solicitation, what we're using for the evaluation on one side, and then what we received from the offers on the other, just so I can compare one by one, so I'm not missing anything. And that's just best tip going forward. If you have the ability, absolutely do it. Have both of them going at the same time so you don't miss anything. So, what are some effective evaluation factors? To name a few, they are factors which are specific to the requirement, written clearly with no room for ambiguity, consistent with the requirements and not running off on a tangent, defining quality levels such as junior versus senior for the staffing, realistic, measurable, economical, and justifiable. All this to say well researched, supported, and leaving no wiggle room for external interpretation. So, considering a real world example of this now, if we said that we had to procure a vehicle, it's it's a very open-ended statement for interpretation. It doesn't leave much to go on. Is it a car, a plane, a space vehicle? Like, could be anything. There's no way to know for sure. And if that's all the information provided, how do you even like propose to something like that? But if we provide additional parameters such as the vehicle must be space-worthy with a dual purpose of being a launch vehicle with capability to carry a payload satellite and carry that payload satellite into a low Earth orbit, the definition and the criteria, the room for ambiguity is lessening, and we're becoming quite a bit more specific. So lowering the chances of interpretation will make evaluations potentially easier to accomplish. However, we just don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole because there is a point to where becoming too specific can lead into brand name or even sole sourcing requirements. So there is a balance of defining the requirement without going too far as to start eliminating potential competitive sources that could meet the requirement. When in doubt, I always find having a conversation with legal to talk to the requirement can be very helpful, especially because the legal team will generally be reviewing the solicitation or the award documentation at some point. So to have some preliminary buy-in, it really never hurts. And on to some examples of evaluation factors that tend to be commonly used in the contracting community. These are corporate experience, which is the degree to which an offeror has actually performed similar work. Past performance, which is the quality of work performed. Management approach, which is the techniques that are used to direct and control an organization. Personnel experience, which is the competence, experience, and/or skills of the personnel to effectively perform the work or services. Or even technical capability, which is the degree to which the technical or management approach demonstrates an adequate understanding of the requirement. As a recent takeaway of evaluation criteria was with past performance and more specifically CPARs to assess the quality of past performance. The pitfall was with the page count that we set up and how important it is to make sure that if you're using a page count to be considerate of how many pages a CPARS report might be or whatever you're requesting might be. An oversight is our team asked for 3 CPARs and a 20-page count limit. This was definitely overly limiting and was a restriction that in hindsight, it actually did limit the quality of the evaluation. It didn't cause it to be dismissed by any means, but the CPARS reports that were provided, some of them had to be partially ignored just because the page count limitation. Ultimately, we were able to make it to the finish line and with the other information, and including with the page count, but as an opportunity for improvement, definitely as a takeaway, be considerate of the parameters being set because sometimes a factor or criteria isn't problematic by itself, but formatting can have unforeseen impacts on what you're trying to evaluate. So digging in deeper into evaluation criteria, we'll start focusing on multiple award schedules, otherwise known as MAS, and multi-agency contract, otherwise referred to as MAC for the evaluation criteria. And just in case there are those who may not be very familiar with MAS and MAC vehicles, a multiple award schedule is a long-term government-wide contract that provides federal, state, and local government buyers access to commercial products, services, and solutions at a pre-negotiated price. For MAS, a good regulation reference I always send people to is FAR Subpart 8.4. So while the multi-agency contract is a contract in which task and delivery orders may be established, this contract type is used by government agencies to obtain both supplies and services. And for MAC, a good regulation reference is FAR 16.505, which is ordering. These FAR references are a good starting point for research, but just know that there's additional information available. So make sure to check regulations specific to your agency, and as always, review your agency's specific policies. But now that we know what a MAS and MAC are, why is evaluation criteria when ordering from these important? To keep it short and sweet, evaluation criteria is important because it consists of the factors that the government uses to evaluate if a proposal or if a quotation will meet the needs of the user, and in some cases, to what extent the proposed solution is anticipated to be successful. Digging further into MAS and FAR Subpart 8.4, what exactly do the regulations state? For MAS orders, FAR 8.405-2D states that ordering activities shall evaluate all responses received using the evaluation criteria provided to the scheduled contractors, meaning evaluate only what we say we're going to evaluate. Keeping in mind that ordering activities is also responsible for considering the level of effort, labor mix, and that the total price is reasonable. We're going to hear a lot about reasonable moving through this presentation. And just for example, I've worked on a requirement where the government cost estimate, the IGC, for level of effort and labor mix wasn't exactly the same as what the quotations were received with, which can be expected sometimes. However, upon review of the quotes with the tech team, the offers actually had a really good and possibly better understanding of how to accomplish the requirement and supported their position for the labor categories and mix. This allowed the government team to leverage this insight from industry as an opportunity for improvement because all the offers tended to come in with a very similar mix and labor. So we were definitely able to benefit from that and improve even the future possibilities of recompetes by using some of this information. So don't be afraid if you get something slightly different than what you initially considered. It's not always a bad thing. So continuing down the regulation path, for MAC orders, FAR 16505, B as in Bravo, 1II, states that the CO has broad discretion for order placement procedures. In a nutshell, this means if you're not the CO, then I recommend talking with the CO if you have any input. I will always say never be afraid to have a conversation with your CO, but just be wary that you don't want to come and be like, well, I just want contractor XYZ or brand name XYZ, because those suggestions generally are never going to be well received. Which leads us into FAR 16505, B as in Bravo, 1, IV, Big Charlie, which is a good segment of information to remember, which is any order greater than $6 million must disclose the significant factors and subfactors, including cost or price and their relative importance. Determining which factors, subfactors, and cost and price might be more important over another might take some coordination, but above all else, whatever is determined, just document it as part of your evaluation criteria and, if needed, source selection plan. I cannot stress this more, but follow the evaluation plan explicitly. Don't deviate from what's determined to be the order of relevance or important, and evaluate what we say we're going to evaluate. So what exactly did the courts say on the subject of ordering from a MAS? The courts are going to look for the rationale or source selection decision documentation to include whether or not there is sufficient detail to show reasonableness. It's that word again, reasonableness. Why is this important? Well, to get right to the point, because whether or not the government follows the evaluation as documented, a protest could still be received. The case referenced is for MAS, and it's a protest that was received shortly after an award of an order. In this case, an offeror protested the agency specifically challenging the task order award to the awardee and challenged the agency's technical evaluation and best value decision trade-off. The claim was that the awardee had an organizational conflict of interest because the awardee had an unequal access to non-public information as a result of being an incumbent subcontractor. The facts were that the award was to be made on a best value consideration for 4 evaluation factors: technical, past performance, price, and veterans' involvement. The technical factor was significantly more important than past performance, which was slightly more important than price, which in turn was slightly more important than veterans' involvement factor. The non-price factors, when combined, were significantly more important than the price factor. In order to receive consideration for award, offers need to receive a rating of no less than acceptable for the technical factor, and offers were cautioned that the agency may not necessarily issue an award to the lowest price or the highly rated technical proposal. So in addition to the RFQ, there was an agency-specific organizational conflict of interest clause in this case, which stated that the offers are to provide a statement describing all facts concerning OCIs related to services to be provided under the solicitation. The contracting officer would utilize this information and other information solicited to obtain and determine whether or not an OCI exists, and if one exists, whether it could be mitigated. So in this case, the agency CO and technical team explicitly followed their evaluation factors, order of relevance, and special clauses. The summary of findings per GAO were that the existence of an incumbent advantage in and of itself does not constitute preferential treatment by the agency, nor is such an occurring advantage that it's necessarily unfair. Given that there was no evidence of an OCI or a basis to conclude that the awardee had an unequal access to information than a normally occurring incumbent advantage as a result of its prior performance as a subcontractor or preferential treatment occurred, the protest was denied. This was definitely a kudos moment for the CO and the technical evaluation team as they thoroughly evaluated their proposals and followed their evaluation plan and documented it. So moving over to MACs, what do the courts say on the subject of ordering from a MAC? For MAC orders, the courts are going to look at the record for determining whether the agency's judgment was reasonable. We're coming back to reasonable again, and in accordance with the stated evaluation criteria and applicable procurement laws and regulations. The commonality between NAS and MAC in the courts are the documented evidence of reasonableness. For MAC, the case referenced is a protest received shortly after award of an order. In this case, an offeror protested the agency specifically challenging that the issuance of the task order was inconsistent with the terms of the solicitation and an organizational conflict of interest. The facts are that the task order would be issued on a best value basis, considering technical, past performance, cost and price evaluation factors. The technical factor was considered to be most important and consisted of the following subfactors listed in descending order of importance: understanding the workforce, and management plan. Past performance was considered to be more important than cost and price. Technical and past performance, when combined, were stated to be significantly more important than price. Offers were advised that the importance of cost and price would increase as the proposals became more equivalent under the technical and past performance factors. The RFP also established minimum educational and experience levels for key personnel. This is an important sentence in this case. In this case, the agency CO and the technical team missed the mark on evaluating key personnel and experience. The evaluators failed to review the experience commensurate to that of the minimum requirements specified in this evaluation criteria. Ultimately, the agency failed to conform to the very specific evaluation criteria set in the RFP, and as such, the protest was sustained. And for the organizational conflict of interest, similar to the mass court case, there still has to be evidence of unequal access to information for the OCI to exist. So where a firm has access to non-public information as part of its performance of a government contract, and where that information may provide a firm with a competitive advantage in a later competition for such a government contract. For this case, the inference or suspicion of an actual or potential conflict of interest was not enough, and as such, that portion of the protest was denied. So for this case, there was an opportunity for improvement that if the key personnel and experience is defined as an evaluation factor, then the CO and the technical team shall follow the evaluation factor as defined for evaluation. And offer experiences cannot be inferred or admitted. It needs to be taken at the written value. So both cases are linked if you want to review in more detail. Neither are very lengthy. So as part of our integrated post-knowledge check number 2, for those of you who got the slides early, don't press the next button. Our next knowledge check is very similar to the first one, except we're going to relieve the pressure for those who might be anxious about public quizzes. So just go ahead and think about what you think the answer you feel is best, and no need to say it, type it, nothing, just kind of consider it. We'll go ahead and read through it and we'll continue on. So for FAR 8.4, the GAO will examine source selection decision documentation for blank. And for FAR 16.505, the GAO will examine that sufficient detail exists to show whether or not the agency's judgment was blank. Was this clarity and simple? So decision documentation for clarity. Agency's judgment was simple. Was it that the decision documentation for reasonableness? Agency's judgment was reasonable. Decision documentation for reasonableness. Agency's judgment was verbal, or even none of the above. Okay. What we were looking for is the GAO will examine source selection decision documentation for reasonableness. And for FAR 16.505, the GAO will examine that sufficient detail exists to show whether the agency's judgment was reasonable. So, good job. Thank you for participating. And we have made it to best practices. So on to best practices, we lean on to Albert Einstein for his genius in that we want to make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. All he was saying was to keep it simple. Be concise in your evaluation criteria to promote competition and efficiencies. Only request what you need and in a meaningful way. The best example I have for this requirement is for deliverables. I know there's a lot of teams out there who've probably seen a lot of deliverable requirements. And when you start asking, who is this report or deliverable going to? No one raises their hand. Same concept with making meaningful evaluation requirements. If you don't need it, potentially don't use it. And so that actually happens quite a bit with recompete. So I would say that if you're doing a recompete, don't just copy and paste. Look at the requirements, look at the factors involved, and actually make those pieces meaningful. If it changes, make sure to review those sections and actually incorporate changes that need to be incorporated. So the factors should be meaningful to the requirement. So it's in our best interest to keep the evaluation effective and meaningful for the integrity of the requirement. And last but not least, try to be as objective as possible. It's easier to verify factors sometimes and kind of use support tied to some of the administration requirements, such as if you can review something to FPDS or even CPARS. Sometimes CPARS isn't as an easily verifiable factor, but it was used as an example, so I will go ahead and let it be an example for you guys. So continuing our best practices, we will talk a little bit about avoiding FAR Part 15 complexities. I'm not going to dive too far into this court case because we've done a lot of court cases today, but the significant points are that FAR Part 15 procedures do not, as a general rule, govern task or delivery order competitions conducted under FAR Part 16. The court typically reviews task order competitions to ensure that the competition is conducted in accordance with the solicitation and applicable procurement laws and regulations, noting that FAR 16.505 does not establish specific requirements for discussions in task order competition. Exchanges in that context, like other aspects of such a procurement, just must be fair. And just as a side note to remember for math, there are no formal debriefs required, only explanation for the basis of award. And for GSA only, there is a GSAM 515.370 requirement for in-depth feedback through open reporting methods and procedures, otherwise known as INFORM, which does apply to FAR Parts 8, 12, 15, and 16. So for GSA only, take down that GSAM 515.370. Just always go back and review it if you have an acquisition occurring in 8, 12, 15, or 16. And continuing our best practices, this slide will discuss being consistent. What do we mean by being consistent? Well, it's about matching a requirement to an evaluation factor. And I love the example of getting resumes if personnel experience is an evaluation factor, because this also helps keeps our offers consistent too. I was assisting a CEO with personnel experience, and our legal recommended a personnel clause for resume submissions to avoid the bait and switch with personnel being submitted versus those personnel being awarded. This suggestion actually baselined what experience and education the offer submitted and prevented a bait and switch from happening for us. The education and experience becomes a minimum requirement for the submitted personnel, and once accepted and awarded, this clause then became really great because it prevented personnel from being replaced at lower qualifications, which was kind of a notable issue that we saw around the 2020 timeframe. So next, formatting submissions is also helpful for evaluations and being organized, but I am not a big fan of requesting a particular type format, such as specifically Arial or even specific page limits sometimes. And the cautionary tale I have with font size is I was once part of an evaluation team that had to pull out rulers because there was a font and margin size format factor. It took a very long time to go through boxes of proposal documents, measuring fonts and margins with a ruler. So I will say format, yes, but just don't fall into the pitfalls that might be arbitrary formatting. With this, I also caution specifying electronic submissions by brand name. So a lot of times we see, please submit PDF. I've made a personal vendetta against, if I see PDF, maybe advising PDF compatible or equivalent. Something very minor can have a larger implication once you start receiving documents. So we just want to make sure that we're not limiting for just a brand name. And last but certainly not least, by any means, we always want to evaluate how and what we say we will evaluate. So moving on to documenting the rationale, the only evidence an acquisition team has with supporting an acquisition decision, or more specifically an evaluation decision, is documentation. The court case provided for reference summarizes a protest challenging the agency's best value award decision, which was sustained because records did not show that the source selection authority performed a price technical best value trade-off before concluding that a higher rated, higher priced quotation offered the best value for the government. Specifically, the FAR subpart 8.4 evaluation omitted sufficient detail with the price and technical trade-off to show that the source selection rationale was reasonable. So as a best practice, document the rationale up front, put in the effort the first time, and include as much detail as possible when documenting any evaluation. And now for considerations or kind of lessons learned. This information is being provided because, as Maya Angelou said, I have a great respect for the past. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. So thankfully, the GAO has provided us with this snapshot of our past, so we know our target for the future. So for fiscal year 2023, there was actually a 22% increase in cases filed during this fiscal year. This is quite a jump, but before you start thinking negatively about what happened in fiscal year 23, the GAO does provide some insight as to why the increase occurred. And according to the GAO report, the bid protest activity for this fiscal year includes the office's resolution of an unusually high number of protests challenging just a single procurement. The procurement involved the Department of Health and Human Services award of Chief Information Officer Solutions and Partners 4, otherwise referred to as CIO SP4, government-wide acquisitions contracts, a single procurement for the award of hundreds of information technology services contracts. So it was pretty big on the news, so you guys might have seen it, but that was the only reason in the drastic uptick was just protests related to that one. The summary of the GAO protests sustained for fiscal year 2023 are shown. And at the top of this list is unreasonable technical evaluations, then flawed selection decision, and unreasonable price and cost evaluations. Given the interest of this slide from our last presentation on the subject, I think it's important to explain the basis of these categories for the sustained bid protests. And so the notes for each are, for unreasonable technical evaluations category, this included the agency's evaluation of a phase 1 proposal where they deemed it unreasonable, where the agency's records and responses to the protesters or to the protests failed to show that the agency reasonably validated all proposed self-scores or reasonably established cut lines for socioeconomic categories to determine advancement of proposals past phase 1 of competition. So that's how they concluded that category. For flawed selection decisions, the agency's best value trade-off decision was unreasonable, where the agency failed to meaningfully look behind the adjectival ratings and adequately document the reasons for finding the protesters and awardees' proposals technically equal before making award to the lowest priced offerer. And then for the third, for unreasonable cost and price evaluations, the agency's evaluation of the awardee's cost proposal was unreasonable, where the agency was required to review indirect cost rates for realism. But the agency instead improperly relied on the awardee's business judgments and applied fair and reasonable price analysis considerations in lieu of assessing the realism of the awardee's indirect rates. And something I just want to touch base on before leaving the slide is one can only work towards reducing the risk of a protest, but one may not ever be able to fully eliminate the risk. And I think this is important to mention. Even the seesaw that I had mentioned previously said kind of the same thing, is we're never going to be able to fully eliminate risk. So we can only do our best to document and just kind of move forward. But it's always good to learn from what we've done. And it doesn't always mean that receiving a protest means you've made a mistake. It just means that someone is protesting. And so our last knowledge check is similar to the prior. So please go ahead and think about your answer you feel best about, and no need to say or type the answer. The question being, the GAO bid protest annual report to Congress for fiscal year 23 contained 3 summary items. Which summary item was discussed in the GAO report in today's training? Your options are unreasonable technical evaluation, flawed selection decision, unreasonable cost and price evaluation, or all the above. And because I know you guys are awesome, I'm just going to go ahead and click right to it because I know you guys selected all the above. And so on to resources. We have made it to our resources. These resources and links are provided to assist you with your acquisition journey. Quite a few of these were utilized to create this presentation, so I will give special mentions to certain resources that I do highly recommend, which are the PSHC Office Hours webinar playlist, FAI Periodic Table of Acquisition and Innovations, the GAO Bid Protest Annual Report for fiscal year 2023, and the newly released 1102 requirement course, FAC 090, Back to the Basics. I've used all these specific resources numerous times in the last month alone, so if you aren't familiar with any of them or all of them, they are really worth the time to take a click. And so also, if there are any attendees interested in the Civilian Services Acquisition Workshop, the upcoming webinar topics and dates are actually displayed. I can personally say that I have attended multiple Seesaw sessions, including in person and virtually, and the engagement and takeaways from my experiences have been enough for me to be a Seesaw pusher and include a slide in here for you. Highly, highly recommend. And I also included the reference link at the bottom, which will take you directly to the Seesaw page. And I did want to highlight the Find Samples, Templates, and Tips link at the very top of the list from the first resources slide. I will do a quick tutorial because the format on the website did change, and with how to locate some of the resources like acquisition plans. And because this is a newly consolidated beta site where lots of templates and resources are now kind of commingled with different search options, there are 3 search options of searching and filtering to include the search box utility, a sort drop-down menu to the right, and a filtered search to include filtered by application, category, subcategory, acquisition phase, community, and tags. So they are all circled in red so you can find them. And for just a search example, I'm going to use the search box utility using evaluation factors as search criteria and sort by features for relevance. The search box and search relevance utility displayed 15 pages approximately of various resources And the resources actually include, but not limited to, Word documents, Interact posts, and there's a plethora of information depending on what the researcher might need. And just to continue the search that we started, I have selected the document that I frequently use for creating task order evaluation factors. Um, there are additional options that you can actually see once I opened up the page. And from here, you are able to actually bookmark, download, and even vote on how useful you found the resource to be. So I just wanted to share this new consolidated resource site because the more feedback and use we get, the better the tools are going to look. And then our Q&A slide. So this actually concludes our training for today on source selection and evaluation factors. And as promised, if there is a need to send any questions about this training, please feel free to send those to pshcevents@gsa.gov. So Jennifer Murrin, please, I apologize if I've pronounced your last name incorrectly, asked a question, does GSA assist with document builds? So I will say it depends, kind of a yes and no question. We actually have a lot of resources and templates available across several of our professional services site, the Oasis site, even Oasis Plus is now building up to what they will be to include templates and resources as well. But we also have the option of even talking to our customer service directors and even professional services advisors where even though we don't put together an acquisition package or anything on behalf of these agencies that might have questions, we have templates and even potentially could pull similar acquisitions to maybe help or assist in developing what might be the right solution for some evaluation factors or criteria. Is there a penalty for contractors for frivolous protests? That is a very good question. And I will say it kind of depends. Is there like a monetary penalty? It depends. It depends on how they protested to determine whether or not they've paid to submit a protest or if they've done the no cost option. Um, I will say probably the most damage or penalty that happens is probably credibility. Because as protests start being received, if a lot of them are getting dismissed, depending on what kind of protests are happening, there's some individuals and offers or contractors that protest and they protest frequently, and it's actually an opportunity for improvement for us. So I will say that it does depend. Penalty per se, as in someone goes to jail or something like that. No, not so much. Do you have a recommendation for how to shorten or better organize an award determination memo when a full trade-off process was used and multiple vendors responded? That is a very good question. So I know the way that I have moved forward with trying to document the decisions and even like as a support to the COs sometimes when we're on technical teams. I like to sit in on the evaluation process and just try to help keep everything specific to the criteria that we had. I am a huge pusher of having like pre-compliance templates, pre-drafted kind of forms to help go through the evaluation process, which then helps with the CO eventually writing the award determination. And that's probably the most significant way that I feel like has improved some of the evaluations processes leading up to the awards decisions, because it's a very organized method that then either you can attach these templates to the award decision for the eventual board of review or business clearance type reviews. And it's a very clear process for, here's when we, received our proposals, here's the compliance checks that we've done, which are typically associated with like the format, or if someone produced the appropriate volumes associated with the evaluation or the solicitation that we're basically putting together in response for the award decision document. And then jumping from that to the evaluation or the TET forms. And it's a little different if you end up using more of the consensus, the consolidated consensus form. But if you have these templates, it makes it so much easier as a CO who's writing the determination to be able to just look through the three and then see the consensus and see how even the evaluation was written, to go through the evaluation of offers and see how the recommendations kind of flowed out. I just found that keeping that organization method, and it's a little bit of work up front. It's a lot when you start having amendments to have to go back and change some of the templates, but it's definitely a very useful method for the COs at the tail end. One of the most recent acquisitions that we did, I supported and helped create some of these templates for even a BPA award. And the award decision was able to be pushed out and created in less than a week, just because we had such good templates in an organization process. And again, the CO was very integrated with the team as we went through evaluations, that it just flowed through to the award decision. And even though there were some criticisms from the business clearance team about some of the choices we may have made, it was still very clear in how we got to them. And so it was something that was easier to justify and easier to show how we got there through the documentation. So I would say the best foot forward is try to do the compliance templates, technical evaluation forms, and consensus in a way that it flows together and then can flow into the award decision easier. This question is, if market research has proven that there are not other sources available for the requirement, would you definitely move to go to a sole source? That is a very good question. I will say it depends on how well your market research is. I actually have an example, and it's a DoD example. I love this example because with space, procurement was sole source for a very long time. And right around the 2014 timeframe, market research was being done. There was political reasons why we didn't want to keep going sole source, and it was tied to a foreign component that was also a critical component for space. And if anybody wants to look it up, anytime you pretty much Google RD 180, it's an engine, and this foreign component kind of kept this procurement sole source for a very long time through a multitude of what they've done with their market research. It eventually led to going away from a non-commercial determination to a commercial determination by trying to open up the procurement by not having that one component. So the way the DoD did it is they did their market research and they were just like, well, it's a foreign component, it's non-commercial, what can we do? And by kind of going through those same questions that we went through with the evaluation factors, some of the things that we started seeing, because we were on the current award as this was going through the recompete process, we saw that there was certain determinations made to, say, go domestic end product only. That was a huge impact in changing the game. That alone pretty much kind of shifted that sole source back into the commercial realm. And we started having additional offers come in that were commercial sources. So now instead of having this one method, which was tried and true, there was nothing wrong with safety, there was nothing wrong with performance, but it was just a shift in what the industry was doing at a time. It was a huge Buy American Act. It was a huge going away from foreign components, and they shifted away and were able to write their RFP to state, look, we want domestic end products only, or a percentage of domestic end products from approved countries. And there are ways to do that. So I won't say that your only option is to go sole source. I would say look into the nitty gritty and see if you can find out what's keeping the requirement sole source. If that's what it is, sometimes it is what it is, and it's just going to be sole source. But sometimes there's something within the criteria or the requirement itself that, if it's not critical and maybe can be changed, or start asking questions about that segment to see if everything but that segment can push out, that could be what's holding the requirement sole source. And so I will say, like, big kudos to DoD, because they found a way to change the space game, and they did a very good job at it. Granted, I still think protests were received and might still even be ongoing, but they did the research and they found a way to move forward towards how the initiatives were working, because obviously this was initiatives pushed down politically. So it's even in response to that, like, they had teams and teams together. And sometimes that's what it is. It's just about pulling together bigger teams to maybe, pull back and scale back how we're looking at a requirement.
For those that are on the line, if you've asked a question in the Q&A pod, it hasn't been addressed, rest assured that we are capturing all of the questions. We will respond to them via email. So no worries there. I just want to thank everybody for their time today. Thank you so much, Becky. That was just really great, very informative, and I think everyone can agree. I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And if you have any questions that you haven't had a chance to ask us here, please go ahead and email us at pshcevents@gsa.gov. And that address is also linked in the slide deck. Thank you very much.